Hey, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out to tonight's panel. My name is Kelly Jo Brick. I am the vice chair of the WGA Genre Committee, and our committee celebrates everything genre, from sci-fi to horror to action to thrillers to fairy tales like tonight. Couple quick thank yous to our panelists for coming out tonight, sharing their time and their experiences with us. Also to the subcommittee for all their hard work to bring this event together, and to Greg from the WGA, who just works so hard and does so much to help bring these events together. If you'd like to come out and check out our next genre committee meeting, it's all online. It's coming up on Tuesday, October 4th, and we would love to have you come out and get to know your fellow genre writers. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Steve Holbert.
Hey y'all, my name is Steve Holbert. Welcome to Thrice Upon a Time, working with fairy tales. Right now, IP seems to be king, so we're going to dive into the original IP, Grimm's fairy tales, and try to figure out why they work so well, talk to some people who've worked with them, and hopefully figure out how to make them work for us in our projects. Our guests tonight are Eddie Kitsis and Adam Horowitz. You might know them from Popular, Felicity. They worked on Lost. They created Once Upon a Time, which we're going to do like a deep dive into tonight. Once Upon a Time in Wonderland. They also did the reboot of Amazing Stories, and my personal favorite, Dead of Summer. And we also have Kelly Younger, who's worked on Muppets Now, Muppet Haunted Mansion, which has my favorite use of the hat ghost ever, so thank you. He's also a professor at Loyola Marymount University and has a doctorate in fairy tales, which is a real thing that we are going to ask how that happened. So we'll start with you, Kelly. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this genre and what we need to know?
Great. All right. Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here and candidly to, nerd out on a topic that I'm a nerd in. I feel super safe doing that in your company of fellow writers and storytellers. Because I, like probably many of you, think that fairy tales are among, the purest form of storytelling. So there's just, there's no way I can cram a 15-week seminar into like 10 or 12 minutes, but I thought I would just introduce some big questions and ideas that will hopefully spark some conversation and maybe even inspire you to write. So let me share my screen here. Just let me know. Is that showing up? They're working? Okay, great. Okay. So I'll start with one of my favorite quotations by Albert Einstein, smartest person in the world, maybe. But he says, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. So I've loved that in terms of the power of fairy tales and the power of storytelling and how it affects our lives. So, but I thought we'd start with, what is a fairy tale? And it's a misleading name because fairy tales are often dismissed as trivial and juvenile, simplistic, superficial, childish, right? And you can dismiss something very easily by saying, well, that's just a fairy tale. But I think that we, as writers and storytellers, we know better, right? On the one hand, very familiar tropes come to mind: princes and princesses and castles and ogres and giants and villains and happy endings and things. On the other hand, it's a much more complex genre than meets the eye. So here's just a couple of quick characteristics for us to consider. So first and foremost, fairy tales are short, right? They're narrative, they're brief, they're easy to digest, they're easy to listen to, they're easy to follow. They're worldly in the sense that there's a lot of journeys, but they're anything but wordy, right? They're always very short. They're generic, which applies for us talking about genre, right? But they're generic because they've been passed down through generations. Folk tales are about folks like you and me, right? That's why they rarely use names, right? It's usually the baker, the cobbler, the weaver, right? And they're more generic so that we can project ourselves onto them. Fairy tales, they rarely in their original form, they rarely explore the inner lives of the characters. They're always much more abstract. Characters, they act and react, but they rarely reflect, unless they're standing in front of a mirror. They're always in the past. It's always once upon a time, never here and now, but always there and then, long ago, elsewhere, Wonderland, Neverland, Faraway Kingdom, Land of Milk and Honey. Um, they're also very much rooted in language. They come from an oral tradition, stories that are told based on words, a real pleasure from listening. It's much later that the tales were written down that they became, literary tales. They're obviously very universal. They explore core human emotions and fears that we all experience. Fairy tales deal with primal anxieties and desires, separation anxiety, starvation anxiety, sexual taboos, violent fears, and fantasies. Um, they're very powerful. Fairy tales, they never talk down to the listener. They never talk down to the child. They never make the listener feel small. That's what myths do. That's what mythology is all about. Instead, fairy tales empower. This is why so many fairy tales are about little heroes. Little Red Riding Hood, Three Little Pigs, Little Tom Thumb, Little Red Hen, the brave little tailor, right? Often in these stories, the little triumph over the big, right? The poor triumph over the rich, the clever over the brutes. Fairy tales are very hopeful. They inspire and offer a glimmer of hope for a way out of trouble. It's wish fulfillment in its purest form. Tolkien identified it in a beautiful essay where he says that fairy tales offer us fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation, which I think is very true. For me, I think a fairy tale is a promise. Ultimately, it's a promise to a child, a promise that you will face difficulty, danger, and despair, but you will not be deserted or defeated for long. Once upon a time promises a happily ever after. Without the happily ever after, a fairy tale quickly descends into horror, right? And so, in a sense, a fairy tale is like horror narrowly averted. Fairy tales are they're not actually really about fairies. They're more about language. There's this close linguistic relationship between the words fairy and fate, between what's enchanted and what is spoken. The word itself is rooted in language, meaning to speak or to bind or to cast a spell through words, to bring together. And most of us, I think, would agree that storytelling has a spell casting quality to it. But these are narratives of magic and fantasy and wonder, and they're understood to be fictional. But just because they're unreal doesn't mean that they're untrue. And I believe that fairy tales are lies that tell the truth. So quickly, what's the purpose of a fairy tale? And there are many. It's escapism, right? Relief from labor, harsh realities of life, anxieties, pleasures in fantasy and romance and invention. Fairy tales are very much about knowledge. It's how we would pass down information from older generations to younger generations about marriage and childbirth and sexual maturity, how to identify villains, right? How to stay safe. They're also very much about limitations. Fairy tales use terror to set limits, to present pictures of peril and possibilities, danger zones, places that we should not trespass, but places that we actually still have to go through. Again, fairy tales offer consolation, relief, and compassion to the wrong. They show the triumph of the disenfranchised. Fairy tales also set up boundaries. They draw social outlines around children and parents and rich and poor, rulers and ruled, humans and animals, right? They're obviously cautionary, a lot of cautionary tales, point out evildoers, learn through the mistakes of others. They are celebratory, We garland the virtuous, we revel in the victorious, we make merry and have fun. They're also can be very bawdy, right? Which we can talk about later. But they're also inspirational. They give us hope. They show examples of cleverness and resilience. But you should know that those moral lessons, right? Like when Little Red Riding Hood, it's a lesson about don't stray from the path. Not originally. Like those morals were tacked on later when they started getting written down and started being used for kind of educational purposes and institutional purposes. So it's interesting when the fairy tale started to get changed in order to drive home a certain agenda, usually a certain sort of moral agenda. They are magical, obviously, but in a fairy tale, magic exists in an ordinary way. Enchantment is a fact of life. Like no one is astonished when magic happens, right? Transformations just happen. They just break down life and death and nature and culture, animals and humans, right? And ordinary things become charming through spells, through curses, through bargains, right? Objects become very powerful, and there's a deep sense of invisible power in things and strangeness in things. They're wish fulfilling, obviously. Wishes are very important in fairy tales for obvious reasons. But the stress falls upon the binding power of words with wishes, right? And that be careful what you wish for, beware of what you utter, right? In fact, fairy tales are a kind of spell, right? When told well, they captivate an audience. They bind them, they capture them. And that's really good storytelling, right? Like we all want to make an audience feel spellbound. And, this is why, a hypnotist will clap their hands to break someone out of a trance. It's also why we applaud at the end of a play or a performance, is because we want to break the spell that has been cast over us for fear of being lost in the story. The final two things, they are communal. Obviously, spinning, weaving, storytelling, it bonds a tribe or a group together, right? We know that stories are the glue of a community. They weave us together, and that's why we associate weaving with storytelling, right? To spin a yarn, weave a tale. And I always like when a studio exec says, the new one is like we have to thread the needle, right? Like so we still have all this kind of language from fairy tales that we use when we talk about how and why we tell stories. Fairy tales are obviously cathartic, right? Dreams of vengeance and power and vindication, pleasure in the release of fears. But most of all, fairy tales are about dreams of justice. And the final slide I'll show you is that fairy tales are very intrinsically linked to justice because children love justice. Or rather, they struggle with injustice on a daily basis. And as Chesterton points out here, fairy tales offer a glimmer of hope that justice can prevail. Now, in Western tales, the wicked are punished, the wolf is devoured, the rightful heir ascends the throne, the dead return to life, the small achieve greatness. The child becomes the adult. It's a real problem. And this is something for us to think about as storytellers, is that when fairy tales are sanitized or altered out of fear that it will scare the kid, scare the child, right? Kids don't get scared in fairy tales because we know and they know there will be a happy ending. And if you ask any kid like what their favorite parts of a fairy tale are, they often focus on the bloodiest, goriest, most punishing parts, right? The grim parts. They love when the wicked get what's coming to them. In fact, it's more frightening if they don't. And I'll end with one quick example. So, in the original tale of the Three Little Pigs, remember that the wolf eats the first two pigs, but it's the third pig who tricks and traps the wolf, then cooks him and eats him. And it's a deliciously satisfying ending. But in the 1933 Disney animated short, which won an Oscar, by the way, remember what happens to the wolf. He lands in the boiling pot of water, he shoots up the chimney, and he runs off into the woods. Because, and you can hear the studio exec's voice saying, like, we can't show a family audience a pig cooking and eating a wolf. But by changing the story, what does that mean, right? It means the wolf is still alive, and the wolf is still out there and will return. And which ending is more terrifying, right? Which ending is really the happily ever after? And for another time, I can talk about how, really, that third pig, by eating the wolf who has the other two pigs in its belly, is really symbolic for like the pig becoming whole and, subsuming all the earlier versions of himself, as well as the monster, which we know really lies within. The wolf is within. But for now, I'll simply just point out that justice is intrinsic to fairy tales. It's part of the DNA. And for me, in our world, especially our current world, where justice feels under attack or worse, abandoned, perhaps fairy tales and new stories based upon them can bring justice back to the throne. That's what children know and want. This is what matters. And Chesterton has another quote, which I love, where he says, "Children are innocent and love justice, while most adults are wicked and prefer mercy." So I'll stop there, and hopefully that will stir up some ideas and questions and conversation for later.
Thank you. I want 15 weeks of that. Like, please.
That was only 10 minutes is all I got right now. Yeah.
I love it. Let's just dive straight in. So you just did like a beautiful ending and talking about why we keep coming back to fairy tales. So Eddie and Adam, can you talk about what drew you to bringing fairy tales to television?
Yeah, it was actually an idea that we had when we were younger writers, and it took 10 years to bring to television. When we first pitched it, we were like, we'd like to do this fairy tale show with dogs, wolves, fairies, dragons, and people were like, no way. And then after Lost, they were like, do you have any crazy ideas with an ensemble cast? And we're like, yes, we do. So, the market changes. But for me, I always loved fairy tales. I think for, a lot of the reasons, the injustice being righted. And I love to me, fairy tales are almost like why you buy a lottery ticket, the hope that overnight your life gets better. A fairy godmother will come down and say, this is not your life. A new life is waiting for you. You just have to be the best version of yourself and get it. And I think I always loved wish fulfillment, and probably from, my youth, I wanted, someone to come and change it. So I think that was for me. Adam, you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a mix of things. I mean, something Kelly just said really resonated with me, which was talking about how kids respond to the grimmest, darkest parts of it. And I always talk about how when I was very young, I remember the first movie I saw was Snow White, and I remember being terrified by it. I remember being terrified by the queen in it, and I also remember like looking away from the screen during it, like I was so scared, and actually have a really distinct memory of like looking and seeing like the projection booth and realizing, oh wait, this is some form of artifice, and like in my little brain, like putting together like this is okay, not real, so I'm sort of safe, and then I'm watching it, and it really kind of stuck with me. So I was like scared, but I liked it, and it really had an impact on me, which is, I think, why, part of the reason why we centered the show around an evil queen and that kind of, some of the terrifying aspects of the show. But I think I've always been sort of fascinated by the kind of the dark parts of it, of fairy tales, but not, as Eddie and I always say, but not the bleak parts of it, about how that there is like a sense of hope that always comes out of fairy tales. And that's something that in our writing we always are attracted to, which is, dealing with darkness, but always finding hope. And I think that there's something in fairy tales that they like intrinsically have that. And I think that really attracted us to them, and we found like a vehicle for that as we created Once Upon a Time.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when we sat around, other things that fairy tales are great at is metaphor. So Adam and I were feeling very like stuck in our career. We felt like we weren't writing kind of what we wanted to, or we weren't getting there. And we started talking about the evil queen and how frustrating it would be to like you get a working oven in a gingerbread house, but you can't kill the two kids. That would be so frustrating. Everything you do fails because of all the happy endings. Where's the one place we can bring it that evil wins? And we said, oh, here, and we'll have a curse. And that's really how it started, which was like just talking about Hollywood led to that.
Yeah, we were thinking about also the darkness in our own world, and like in how like, yeah, like the kind of the dark idea that the evil queen would think, yeah, this would be the place where she could win, and this would be the place where darkness could win, but then finding an antidote to that, and the idea started to kind of snowball out of that. But it's for us it was always about like taking like what we always talked about as like our kind of collective memory of what these stories are, and then using them as a jumping off point to kind of like filter them through like new stories we wanted to tell.
Oh, that's a perfect segue. So you wanted to, awesome job. So y'all mentioned that the evil queen was your way through Once Upon a Time and the way you found your way into the story. And you just mentioned wanting to talk about news stories and things that interest you. So how did you craft-wise like to enter a story and say, we're going to tell a personal story, but with this public domain, with this fairy tale? How did you do that over and over again so well?
I don't know.
Well, first of all, I don't know if we did it so well or not.
Yeah, I don't know. You should ask a few people. No, we had this idea and we really loved it. We didn't really know how to tell it. And when we did 6 years of Lost, we started to kind of find our writing and our style. And so originally, Once Upon a Time was just going to be an opening in the fairy tale world. And then all of it takes place in the real world. And we thought, no, you're not showing what they were from before. So for us, it was about a character study. And we started to say, what are the mysteries that we want to answer? Well, why is Grumpy grumpy? Why is the evil queen evil? Why is the Mad Hatter mad? So when we would sit to write a story, you have to further, the whole arc of the season. But each episode, like Lost, we would focus on one character and what makes them tick. And so the idea was that Emma would come in and as the sheriff, she would solve the problem that they couldn't solve. We didn't give them the happy ending in the Enchanted Forest. It was taken from them. So she had to return it in the real world using real world things. And so once we came up with that model, that's just kind of what we applied for the, for really the whole show.
And we took the approach in a couple ways of what do you think of these stories, and then try to kind of subvert those expectations. And then the other part of it was the mashup, which was like finding unexpected ways to take these stories and intersect them, because we thought, in the most juvenile way possible, we loved playing with our action figures when we were kids, and we're like, why can't the Star Trek figures play with the Star Wars figures? I have them both, and in some ways, taking that to the storytelling place of like, well, we've got Little Red Riding Hood and Snow White, why can't they be best friends, and what would that mean? And then taking it seriously, though, and really thinking about who these characters are, what emotionally they're going through, what that would mean if they were people in the real world, and what that friendship would look like, and what that would mean. And then that would kind of lead to the stories we would want to tell.
On the flip side, Kelly, since we know that the Brothers Grimm took these stories and they kind of filtered them themselves, did any of their personal autobiography kind of information seep its way into the fingerprints of these stories over the years that we know of?
Yeah. Well, I mean, how their fingerprints are all over it, and not always in the best way, right? Like it. On the one hand, again, these were all oral stories passed down, and in the same way, the Adam that you were just talking about, like, why can't these action figures play together? Why can't I make up a new story with these two characters? That's how these original tales were told. Like, they would get told differently every time. And so that's why there's 800 different versions of Cinderella from every continent, right? They're all different versions. But also, like you just said, Adam, about like, why can't Little Red Riding Hood and Snow White be friends? Well, they can, but also, why are we drawn to that? Because some people feel lost and vulnerable in the woods, and some people feel under the oppressive thumb of someone in their family. And so we sort of put ourselves onto them and go, of course I want a friend like that, right? And so that's how it works, right?
Yeah.
But what the Grimms did, and others, again, and it gets politically complicated, because the Grimms weren't just altruistic, like, let's capture these stories so that we can preserve them. There was an agenda of, like, we need a national German literature. Like, we need to sort of unify Germany, and we're going to do it through storytelling, which has a complicated history, right? And so they would reshape these stories in some of the original stories, like in Hansel and Gretel. It was not a stepmother; it was a mother. But the Grimms were like, well, what mother could actually abandon her children in the woods? It has to be a stepmother. It has to be like. So they changed a lot of things to sort of fit in with their own moral worldview at the time. And then they also stamped a very sort of Christian worldview on a lot of these stories as well. The original Little Red Riding Hood is super, body burlesque. It's suggestive. She is clever. She, there's a sort of a strip tease to the wolf of, like, my grandma, what big eyes. Like, and it was meant to be like kind of like a dirty joke, but she kills the wolf in the end. She escapes. She saves herself. So then when you look at go, well, where's the huntsman come from, and why did the man have to come in and save her? And you go, oh, okay, well, this was now written down by some dudes who were like, well, clearly the men have to come in and save. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of changes that were made that reveal the time in which they were, writing these oral stories down, and how they were changing them. And so we've lost some of the original, but then sometimes the power of that original story keeps coming through, or keeps trying to break through. So it's a complicated history.
Well, since they're updating stories, and then we're updating from a short story medium to a long form medium, a lot of changes that y'all made in the show were really surprising. One of my favorites was, we know Little Red Riding Hood. We know there's a hood, there's a wolf, there's a grandma. You were like, why not add a werewolf? And now I can't imagine life without it. So thank you for that. My question is, any advice for people who are trying to remix these stories and do their own thing, but still keeping that kernel of truth? Because werewolves or not, it still felt like Little Red Riding Hood at the heart of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it was, we just didn't want to retell what you've seen from Disney, which is what I think a lot of people thought when we were coming out, is we were just going to follow that. And I think that Disney was always happier when we would do our own thing, because then once was its own thing. And for us, it was really just kind of what Adam said about putting toys together. I think the room was very creative. It was like, Peter Pan, we made a villain. And the network they were like, well, why? I was like, well, who would want to be 13 for the rest of their life? Anyone who was so happy at 13 is probably not a bully. Like, I hated junior high and I'm still in therapy from it. So so for us, it was literally that.
And
we were going to make him our 7th grade bully. And then he was someone's father. So what we realized is we made him someone's father on the show, because for TV, unlike a movie, is you have to have people are invested in the characters first. So I loved Friends. I don't know if I could name 3 storylines. I just wanted to be in that apartment and hang out. And so for us, it was like the characters and how it impacts them was important. And a son, one of our villains, you realized, was scarred because his father abandoned him to be youthful. So then it was like that took on a measure, because by the time this happened, 2 seasons had gone by, and you started to go, oh, now I get insight into this character's depths. For Little Red Riding Hood, I think, Adam, do you remember how?
Yeah, it came as I think most of it came from, which was, as you were saying, Eddie, character, which was discussions coming out of what was Ruby's relationship with Granny about. And we were trying to figure out what was our take on why they had this contentious relationship that we were portraying in Storybrooke, and what was the root of that, and what would be a reason that she would be in this, in the crisis she was in present and in the past. And then we were trying to think like what would be a reason to be afraid of the wolf, and that led to discussions about what could be a reason to be fearful of the wolf. And sorry, go ahead.
We also wanted to explore the universality of I Want to Leave Home, right? So we always tried to take, as Kelly was saying, the collective story, and we wanted to retell it at a new campfire, but like also take universal truths or universal stories that you now added into it. And so sometimes we would borrow from movie tropes and bring them in. So Luke Skywalker, I Want to Leave Home, like any small town, and then at the end, like Kelly was saying earlier, it's wish fulfillment, but it's also be careful what you wish for. Because once she was exposed and found out she was the wolf, she could not come back to the village. So she had to run off with Snow White. And that was kind of growing up. You can't go back. So for us, it always was character. And then we would put on these other things.
Love it. Since we're even to the wolf metaphor, Once did a really awesome job using different metaphors for issues. We had werewolves, we're exploring blindness through werewolves. We had toxic relationships with people snatching hearts left and right. And so is there anything in particular you're very happy you like snuck in there with the metaphor that you thought maybe we couldn't get away with this if we did it in a more straightforward way?
I don't know if it was sneaking anything in with a metaphor so much as like, I think we were happy we could use the metaphor to explore all the things we did. I think that, I think Eddie was touching on this a little bit. I mean, that was part of the attraction of telling these stories, which was you can explore all different sorts of things through these stories, and they can be about so many different things, because they're about so many different things, and particularly in the way we constructed ones with the characters in different worlds, in different iterations of themselves, it allowed us to kind of explore all different kinds of issues of identity and figuring out who they were, and through through the idea of, story itself and the story we were telling. So it became
the network, and being on ABC allowed us to, write not just for children. We were writing for adults. So they were fine. So we never had to be truly subversive in the fact that we snuck something through and Disney didn't know, because they were supportive. And I think just in the beginning of the show, we said, this is a show that's going to explore everything, but they're going to explore it through these means. And so, so I don't remember anything subversive per se, but I'm sure we did. Usually it's like an Easter egg. It's usually something silly that's like an inside joke in the writer's room that you got in, so that when we watch dailies, we'd all go, ha, ha, ha. And it was like just our favorite lunch place.
And Kelly, over time with these fairy tales, have the metaphors seemed to have changed, or have there been any patterns where maybe in a period with Little Red was about this, and then every 100 years it comes back and we keep hitting the same thing over and over?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think the answer lies in the fact that we're still telling fairy tales and talking about them. And I think it's because they're so malleable and because you can change them so easily. Like it'd be a lot of work to retell War and Peace in a new way.
Yeah.
Like really resonate with everybody, right?
You'd need a whole new glossary.
That's right. I'm sure somebody can do it. It's great. But, there's, I would do this thing with my kids, and I have a son and a daughter, and they're super annoyed that I am obsessed with this stuff. But like there is this thing of like, I don't think that you should read fairy tales to kids. I think you should tell them, because you're going to mess it up, or you're going to accidentally throw like Aunt Gladys in there. Like you're going to do funny, weird, personal things that just makes it more meaningful. And you pretty much know the story that you're trying to tell anyway. But a fun thing to do is, get started on a familiar fairy tale and then stop and say to the kid, and what happens next? And then just let them run with it. And it gets crazy, right? But I think to answer your question, Steve, I do think because they are so fluid and so simple, that there are very different versions of these tales, not only in every sort of time period or culture or historical moment, but I think every time it's told, that it's a different story every time it's told. And I think that as writers, we can use these fairy tale elements sometimes without being so literal, right? Like we can turn to them for certain sort of not only story structure, but like you were saying, Eddie, about like questions of like not wanting to be alone or wanting to leave home, or like these questions that we all deal with. And I think that we can find familiar patterns in ways that you don't realize it's a fairy tale that you're looking at. Like even with for Muppets Haunted Mansion, I really looked, it was Hansel and Gretel. It was like Gonzo and Pepe the Prawn were going into a gingerbread house, and then I knew they had to get separated, and one of them almost had to die. But no one's going to go, oh, that was just a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, right? And if you think about something, one of the most powerful moments for me in the movie Schindler's List, of a very powerful movie, the only splash of color in that entire movie is the little girl in the red coat. And that is Little Red Riding Hood in the Warsaw Ghetto with the wolves as Nazis. It's just, and it was never spoken, it was never identified, but that was tapping into the sort of primal nature of fairy tales, and how just that splash of color in that moment, it heightened every primal fear that we were feeling in the audience. And it became a new kind of metaphor in that new moment, right? But that's where I think we can, there's so much potential here with these stories. They're very complicated in a very simple way. Yeah, if that made any sense. Yeah.
No, it does. It's interesting because when we were in the writer's room, we never would go to, Wikipedia to look up the old stories.
Right.
It was, what do you remember? We only wanted what everyone remembered so that we could retell it. It was why Once opened with the end of Snow White, because we needed, it was Adam had the idea and I loved it. It was the idea of we needed to let the audience know that we're not doing what you know, we're going to do the next day what you never saw.
Right.
And it was like, you know, and it was like in that moment, it gave the audience to permission to say, hey, we're all going to tell new stories together.
Right.
I think Kelly also just said something very important, which was about they can be very complicated in a simple way. And I think that's important because to me, I always say is that the hardest thing to be is simple. And it's like it can be in writing, at least for me, it's like it's very easy to be convoluted and complicated in storytelling, but to be simple is difficult. And I think with these stories, there is so much like kind of buried in all of us with them, as you were saying, Kelly. And I think that tapping into that, there is a depth, there is a complexity to emotions and feelings that can be brought out by them. And that if you can tap into it in the right way, which is hard to do, but if you can do it, it is incredibly powerful. And it feels simple. The emotions feel very simple and primal and real, but like the audience reaction to it is massive. And I think it is why people keep coming back to different iterations of these stories. And it's not because everybody loves these stories like literally so much. There's something about the emotions of them that are so ingrained in all of us, that if you find a way to tap into them and meld them into the story you're telling, it can have very powerful results.
I think that's great. And I don't know about you, I'm assuming so as well, and all of us writers here, but like, it's sometimes we can get really stuck in our heads. We can get really intellectual and trying to do logic things, and we're always trying to move the story down into the heart and into the emotions. But there's this other interesting thing that might be helpful to people, is that fairy tales are not really about the heart, they're about the stomach. Like, so many fairy tales are about food. It's all about food and eating and trying not to be eaten, and so there's also this element of fairy tales which I find helpful as a writer, of like trying to stay in my gut, like trying to go with like, what's the gut, what's this character's gut telling them to do, because I like the gut never lies, the heart lies all the time.
Mm-hmm.
As does the head. So I loved what you just said there about like trying to dig down deep into that. But I just think it's fun that there's I think there's even deeper layer, which is really intrinsic to fairy tales, which is it's so much just about eating. It's just about trying to find enough food, and so that you don't get eaten yourself.
The other thing that you said that resonated with me, where you were talking about the things we keep coming back for like the hope, and y'all just kept giving us happy ending after happy ending. And Kelly mentioned that was a big part of fairy tales, is we know there's going to be a happy ending, so we can, blind some sisters and kill everyone, but Cinderella will be fine. Like, yeah. As long as our lead is fine, we're having a good day. So my question is, on a craft level, how did you keep crafting happy ending after happy ending, but keeping it fresh and keeping it not cheesy, as in a respectful way, like not making it like the cheesy happy ending you would expect from a fairy tale?
It was hard, because what we would always do is we would do the old, we would give you the happy ending, but then we would give you the teaser for the next episode. So we would always end on a cliffhanger because it was still TV. For us, what was interesting is when we pitched this show, it was in 2010, and Lost was ending, and everything was about the anti-hero. Everything was about dark, cable, complicated men doing complicated evil things, but you like them. And the financial crisis just happened, and we were like, can't we just have something where it's hopeful? And so we created the show on hope. And so what we realized is people want the happy ending. What they want is to be surprised how they get it. So you don't want to watch Cinderella and then have her like make up with the stepmother and just stay home. It's like but so for us, it was all about like, what's the thing you didn't know that brought that? And what was interesting is that there was one episode we did a Hansel and Gretel, and the evil queen was so mad at them, she put them in this infinite labyrinth, ripped them from, it was like the darkest thing we had ever done. And these two little kids were in this really dark thing in a dailyscape, and we got this call. And we were like, don't you get it? We get a freebie here. Because in the very next scene, they're reunited with their dad in Storybrooke. I go, so let's scare everyone, because they only have to wait. They don't even have to wait through the commercial. And they were like, oh yeah, all right. And they because it was a lot of what you were saying. Season 1 is, how dark can we be? How hopeful can we be? Because no one had really done fairy tales on TV. They'd only just kind of known them. Yeah.
There was another element too, I think, which was the villains on our show, which was we having the evil queen and later on the Wicked Witch of the West, having Rumpelstiltskin throughout the show. You had these villains who were antagonists to the classic fairy tale heroes, whether they were Snow White, Cinderella, Prince Charming, whoever, and they would get defeated in their plans over and over. But the villains we made also sympathetic in a way. We made them understandable in a way, and we made you hopefully want their redemption. So
I think it's what you said earlier, Kelly, about adults want mercy. I think that just hit me, because we did redeem them, but I think in a world of television, what we started to realize was season 1 and 2, everyone liked the evil queen defeated, but by season 2, they were like, wait, this is a dysfunctional family show where we would like to see the stepmother and the daughter and everyone come together. So then it became about like, well, what made their pain?
So like,
and then because for us, we thought a show about hope has to be hopeful for everyone.
Right.
Everyone should have a chance at redemption, which is different than if it was 2 hours. Sorry, Adam.
Yeah, right. So to answer your question, Steve, though, like going all the way back to like the second episode, like where we show the evil queen cast her curse, we see she does it by ripping out the heart of her father. And so she's casting this curse, and our heroes outwit it, which is quote unquote a happy ending to an extent, but yet you see this incredible price the queen has paid for it. So there's a happy ending, but there's also not really a happy ending. So we're giving you a happy ending, but we're also in a way like making you like, okay, she is our villain, but we're also hopefully now like, what is this going to do to this woman that she did this thing, not just to these people, but to herself. So you're like now hopefully invested in what's going to happen to her. So you're getting happy endings, but also like hopefully a longer arc of redemption, or maybe a longer arc of a fall that doesn't lead to a redemption. In some cases that did happen. So we would try to balance it that way so that you were not always just getting a pat ending on things. And then we would also try to vary it where sometimes unexpectedly heroes would become villains or villains would become heroes, and trying to switch it up that way would hopefully keep it fresh and unexpected, and hopefully keep the audience interested.
When I think that led to the longevity of the show, because as you said, when you started digging into what made this villain, what was their trauma, what was their wound, like what, and we get that story, and we then sympathize with them, we understand them, even if we hate them or love them because we hate them. But one character's happy ending is another character's tragic ending.
Right.
And so You know, it's when, and that's, you know, why I think Sondheim in Into the Woods
Mhm.
really lean into that beautifully, in the sense of like the ambiguity of these things, of like, just because this character gets a happy, like as you said, Steve, like, you know, Cinderella's sisters get their eyes poked out and their toes chopped off and their heels chopped off, but Cinderella's happy, she got a happy ending, and we're like, but those sisters also had a difficult mother, right? It's like so, and so that's why I think it gets interesting to look at those characters that we're so quick to write off, or we remember writing off, or remember not liking because we sided with the hero. But then when you really sort of open up the world of these characters and figure out, well, you know, all of them are victims of injustice, even the ones who administer the injustice, right, who become the evil queens, who are so unjust. They that's a reaction to an injustice in their life. And so, you know, it's I think that's what works so well for your show, keeping it going so long, is because, you know, heroes became villains, villains became heroes, but they got their happy ending, but it was at a cost, and usually it's at a cost to somebody else.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and then that festers, and then that grows, and then that becomes a thing.
Second that. Get it. Okay. Y'all are so wonderful. Like all my questions are just taken off for ask. Um, since we were talking about the longevity of the show, um, fairy tales are super short. Y'all had 7 seasons of them, and we still couldn't get enough, and y'all kept spinning them and spinning them. So, any craft tricks or any advice for people who want to take such a short form and do something long out of it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we had to figure it out as we went. I mean, obviously 6 years of Lost helped, but you know, when we premiered, it was Sunday night at 8. It had only been, you know, reality for the last decade. We were against the World Series in football, and every pundit in Hollywood predicted us first to be canceled. So what happened was Adam and I were like, all right, well, let's just do really 7 good episodes, because you usually get 7 or 8 before they pull you. And then the next morning, we were the #1 new drama of the year, and it shocked us. So the first year was, oh my God. And then what happens is our plan was for 5 seasons. And I think that the key to longevity is not plot, it is character. And so where do you want to move the character? Well, we knew we wanted to move the evil queen to eventually end up as just the queen. And, you know, so you take these long arcs, and where do you want to get to them? And then, you know, you have to really plan. So in between every season, we would have what we call mini camp, and we would plot them out. And you started to notice, what we realized was, as TV started to change and there were streaming models, Network 22 was really, it was too impossible to keep people serialized the whole way. So we started to break the seasons up in fall season and spring season. We do an arc for each. So that made it more manageable. So now, yes, we had to do 22 episodes, but it was actually 11 and 11. And then you can plot 11 and 11 and then say, where do you want to get to? And then we always would say the finale is a movie. Finale is just going to be our own weird thing, and we're just going to enjoy that. But like, that was kind of how we did it.
On the flip side, though, the hard part was it was actually like doing 14 seasons, which made it challenging. But also, Steve, to answer your question, I like second what Eddie said, like character. It was like always about like figuring out where we wanted to take the characters and then trying to build the story out of that. And then with the fairy tales themselves, it was, and going into them oftentimes, and sometimes Rosencrantz and Guildensterning them, like finding like the little pieces of like, well, what's Gus doing in this story, and then playing with that, and to Kelly's point, like what's the point of view from this character, and how did it affect them? And once you start to look at these stories from different angles, you can really kind of think about emotionally what Cinderella means for the stepsisters, or what what Snow White means for whatever other relatives in the family, the extended family, as we built it out, and then you can start to figure out well, the huntsman is something you can really mine in a way, and then it just starts to open up. But it's all about character, and for us, then you find these little pockets and you think about the character, and then once you for yourself understand what you want to do with a character, for us it's like the stories start to build out of that. And then the challenge always was, okay, how do you build an 11 episode arc out of one of these things? And that's always challenging. It's very difficult, but if you know where you want to take the character, it makes it that much easier. It can never be, or at least for us, we never felt comfortable making it about plot. We have to tell a story that's just about a thing happening.
And if we did, it was one of our least favorite. It was a learning lesson. Oh, that was too much plot in that.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to say we're 100% successful. We weren't. We did our best, but that was the bar we would set for ourselves. And and when we felt like we succeeded, we felt good about it. But it's like that would be what we would try to do.
Is that kind of? It's really interesting because you say TV now and focusing on this show was character driven. And Kelly, in the original, it seems almost plot, right? For fairy tales more than character. And so somewhere in human history, did we just flip that switch? And we were like, it's really about the people going through the woods and less about the moral?
Yes, in 1873, that was the moment. I have no idea.
Awesome.
But it's a very good point, which is those super short, simple fairy tales are very plot driven. And, oftentimes it's the first sentence, they're, everything happens in the first sentence. I'm trying to think one off the top of my head, but something like, a miller had a daughter and the king came by and he said she can spin gold. And you're like, and we're off. And now there's a problem. And it's as simple as that. But we don't know anything about the character. We don't know why the father would say some bullshit thing like that to the king and get his daughter. There's no backstory. There's no what happened. Why is he a single parent? There's none of that. So it truly is, in those early versions, in those original versions, there's very little character, right? And I think that's, on the one hand, why the fairy tale genre is so timeless, but I also think it's why, when they're adapted well, they're so successful, because they're craving character, they're craving character development, and we already feel connected to the character, but through their wish, right, of what they want. But when you add to the character why it is what they want, and how they're going to go about getting it, and what is in their way, who is in their way, that's where I think it really comes alive. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but they're very plot driven. Which is a good point.
That completely answers my question. Also, if anyone else has a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will get to that so y'all can have questions. And I don't have to keep coming up with them and looking like I prepared. That would be great. So my other favorite thing about Once Upon a Time is when I first watched it, I related with Henry. And then I had kids and Regina started making more sense the older I got.
Yeah.
And then I realized the show had not changed, but my life had changed. So when you're crafting these things, can y'all talk about the duality of writing something for kids and something for adults that is playing on two levels at once.
Well, I think the first part is we were never writing for kids. Like it's like I think the thing we always feel about kids and having kids, you know, myself and I think Eddie would agree too, is they never like being treated like kids. Like, you know, so we would never write down to the audience. We'd always write something for everyone. And so we always tried to write Henry as a smart, like, you know, kid who was, you know, he was still a kid, but, you know, he was trying to make his way through the world and figure things out in a, you know, in a pretty active, pretty you know, I don't want to say mature way, because he was still a 10-year-old boy at the start, but like but in a way that wasn't like childlike or hopefully didn't feel artificially like kid-like, and that so that the situations he were in were hopefully felt real, and hopefully his reactions felt real, and that the situations could be scary, they could be harrowing, and they could be, you know, intense, and you know, and then it's and I guess going back to the kind of stuff Kelly was talking about before, which is like, you know, I think, you know, on some level, kids know that the fairy tales are going to work out in some way so that they can kind of go along for that ride. And I think that allowed us to do that. But also to what you're saying, Steve, like, you know, as parents, like, I think it was very important to us to write Regina and Emma and Snow and Charming and all the parents on the show as real parents, as a real families that were dealing with like what it's like to have children, and to really kind of think about, as crazy as the situations were, like what it would be like if your child were going through these various things, or if you were separated from your child, or all the sorts of situations they were in.
And Kelly, for the original, when the Grimm brothers did their book, were they for children? Were they for adults? Like, who were these scary things for?
Well, that's interesting because originally, again, a lot of the tales when they started getting written down in the Western ones in Germany and France and Spain, like they weren't. No, they were not for children because not everybody could read, right? Like so, it was still so. There was this interesting period where these these folk tales, which were meant for the community, which were meant for families, for children, for generations, right? Where you get old wives' tales and things like just knowledge being passed down. They were meant to bond the community together. Now, when they started getting written down, like I said, with the Grimms, who had kind of a national agenda, Perrault in France had a very sort of elitist agenda, right? This is why the French fairy tales became very much sort of salon culture, very aristocratic. It was meant for those who could read and who could afford books. But then, as a result, you know, the French version of Little Red Riding Hood has a little moral attached to the end of it, which is basically like, you know, young ladies at court, beware of those handsome young men because they are actually wolves in fancy clothing, right? They became these moral lessons for, again, not for children. But then when printing, reading became more common, they started using fairy tales for education because they just were such simple little reading stories. And that's why in the 19th century, so many, you know, books and like the children's book was invented, right? Like children's books is kind of a recent thing. And they were these very simple stories, again, meant to like educate, indoctrinate, institutionalize, teach lessons. And that's when they became for children. And there's sort of an interesting parallel track with like Mother Goose and nursery rhymes, and then they got, you know, sort of reduced. They got drained of all that like rich violence and sexual undertones and conflict and all of that primal stuff that we need to deal with, and they became these kind of just whimsical bedtime stories, right? Like you would not read an actual Grimm fairy tale as a bedtime story to a child, right? That is terrifying. So they
I'm a
became,
horrible parent.
yeah. Well, I mean, no, I would do it all the time too. Like, you know, Bluebeard is amazing to send a kid to sleep to. But like, if you know what I'm saying? But like, they became these kind of toothless stories, and so that's how they kind of ended up for children. So I actually think it's wonderful how a lot of contemporary writers are reclaiming them and sort of infusing that back into these stories in a very contemporary way that are like let's not be afraid of these things, because it, you know, we are afraid of these things, and actually we're craving for help to get through that fear, and that's what stories should do. So, you know, I don't want a story to put me to sleep. I want a story to keep me awake, you know.
Yeah.
We have some Q&A questions in, so let's see what everybody else is doing. First of all, thank you all for showing up and listening to our panelists, and thank you for our panelists for showing up and educating us. So Matthew wants to know, can y'all talk about the ways in which you try to have darker moments, like a death or a breaking of belongings, not linger too much before you return to the fun?
Oh, well, that's pacing, I guess. You know, and I think that, you know, for us, it's almost like an episode's like a song or like an opera. Like you want to know what notes to hit. You know, for us, if you're going to build to a really dark moment, there has to be a release at the end, or it becomes bleak. So, you know, you can get to a really, really, really dark moment, but you have to let the audience know, even if you don't resolve it, that hope is on the way. You know, so I think that for us, you know, a lot of people will take a really dark moment and then undercut it with humor right away. But you know, it's really about personal taste and when you're pacing your show and what your tone is. For once, it was the tone was a moving target, and each episode dictated the tone. So the Mad Hatter episode and an Evil Queen episode was going to be different than the Jiminy Cricket episode, or you know, the dream. So for us, it was a matter of that. But I would say that, you know, you if you're going to hit those dark moments, you know, is that your tone, or are you building to that so that it pops? And that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think Eddie's absolutely right. It's about tone and what you're trying to achieve, and then you have to like figure out for yourself what is the right balance and what you're trying to say, and then that'll dictate.
Yeah. So, for instance, the darkest thing we ever did on the show was in episode 2. Was we saw that the Queen didn't. She threatened to have the curse in the pilot, but in episode 2, we figured we learned that she didn't actually have the curse yet. she wrote a check she needed to get the money for, and she could not make it work because the last ingredient was the heart of the thing you love most, and it became her father, and he understood what was happening. So it was a very dark moment, but in this, he was very resigned, and he said, this isn't, you know, I hope this is going to put a hole in your heart you're never going to fill. And then when we cut to that and you see his grave, his name was Henry. And then you pull back and realize why she named Henry after her dad. And you started to realize this was an evil queen who was so bent on revenge, she killed her dad, who now is wondering why I'm not happy. And so that started the journey of the evil queen is not just the villain of the show. She's somebody you should pay attention to, because maybe you're like her too. Maybe you feel like you've done something bad and you want redemption.
And in some episodes, we'd have a lot of humor. That's one where it would have felt very inappropriate to like cut to a very funny story at that point. You want the emotion to really play there and really land and sit with the audience. So it's about tone and just knowing what your story wants to achieve.
Thank you all. The next question we have is Kelly talked about a bunch of different fairy tales examples, the different iterations of Cinderella. They wanted to know how and once went about choosing which stories you used and which ones. So sorry, I had a moment. They want to know how you went about choosing the stories that you chose. And yeah, let's go with that.
Well, I think, we had our characters on the show, and the stories from which they came would be a well we would draw upon often. And then it would be often about, like what we talked about before, that kind of mashup idea. And we would think about, where would they intersect? What would be a fun place for these characters to kind of collide, and who would they collide with? And then that would lead to, Snow is friends with Ariel, and then you could go into that world of Little Mermaid, and how do you play with that? And then that could open up storytelling avenues and different stories you would want to explore.
Yeah. And when we did the pilot, I think we had very much Lost on our brain. So here are the people on the island, and we're going to tell their flashbacks. And when we choosing them, it was like, all right, well, Red and Granny, Jiminy Cricket. We just started to talk about characters. Oh, well, Jiminy Cricket is Henry's psychiatrist in Storybrooke, and we just started to do that, and we knew we had the evil queen, but we knew we needed like a wild card character. And that's when Rumpelstiltskin came in. Because what we realized is nobody really knew who he was. Like, everyone knows Rumpelstiltskin, everyone knows Spin Straw to Gold, but very few people actually know the story. In fact, the first moment I thought our show was going to work was we were all in Vancouver, and one of the writers on our staff goes, "Oh my God, do you know what the #2 Google search in the world is right now? Rumpelstiltskin." Because everyone was like, wait, who is that? And so for us, it was like, let's take some iconic characters and we're going to show you the real story, but let's add a few that we're going to just make up on our own.
What I would add to that is, since we're talking about, IP king or whatever the subtitle is, but like it is very tempting to go like, I'm going to buy a book of fairy tales and I'm going to go through and I'm going to find the most obscure one that has not been told, and that's how I'm going to sell my script. And then, but again, people are like, but I've never heard of that story.
Yeah.
I don't know who's going to want to watch that. So, I mean, one thing that I would throw out there to recommend to us as writers is that fairy tales are so much about questions, right? And who am I? Whose am I? Where am I from? Am I safe? How am I going to get through this problem? Are there good benevolent powers looking out for me? Are there evil powers after me? And so I always find that starting from a place of my own personal question leads me to potentially find a fairy tale or a story out there that resonates with me, and then I can maybe find some inspiration in that, or find a new way to tell that story. Like Eddie was just saying, like Peter Pan was basically a 7th grade bully and you hated 7th grade. You didn't probably start by going, hey, we have to do something with Peter Pan. It was more of like, there was this thing in you of like, who, what am I still dealing with? What questions do I still have? Like, why does that kid get celebrated? And that then led you to Peter Pan. So I think kind of remaining in the question in terms of, what you want to write about is a way to get to the tale, as opposed to going through the index and trying to find like the most obscure tale that has not been made into a movie yet. Because like Steve pointed out, we keep telling the same stories over and over. Like we do crave new versions of these same stories. We want to see them told in new ways, but we also want to connect with them in a way that we go, well, I connected with it this way when I was a kid, and like Steve said, and now I connect this way as a parent or as an adult, and then I'm going to connect with it again when I go through a different phase in my life or encounter something else that's different. Like, we do want to keep coming back to these stories because they're so comforting. But we also we change, and we want to feel like we're changing, and we want to feel like it's new as well. So I think the question helps in there.
I think that's a great point, and it's like, you know, a question Eddie and I would get asked all the time was like, "What's your favorite fairy tale?" And you know, what one of the answers, you know, I would give, and it would be like Star Wars, you know, and it'd be like, that's a fairy tale in so many ways. And Toy Story is a fairy tale. And I know you've done a lot of work with Pixar, Kelly, and it's like those are fairy tales.
Yeah.
Like they're and it's taking, you know, these stories that are ingrained in us and finding ways to like filter them through new kinds of stories, but they're, you know, they're stories that are familiar but new. And I think I think that's such a great point, Ellie, about like not looking for the most obscure thing nobody's ever heard about in a newly discovered grim book, you know, somewhere, but rather finding a way to like have these archetypes used in a way that is familiar but new, if that makes sense.
Well, and they did recently discover tons of new fairy tales out of Germany, and I was like, oh great, I'm gonna make movies out of this. And I'm like, how am I gonna sell the turnip princess? Right? Like, how is this? I mean, maybe, I don't know. But Adam, I think
land of the forgotten princesses.
Well,
so like, so Snow White gets her own theme
Kelly,
park.
let's sidebar after this.
I know, sidebar. I know, it's like, and I got turnips. That's what I got. But but your point. But Adam, you're right. Star Wars is a fairy tale, and I think the Joseph Campbellness of it, or the Joseph Campbell kind of anvil that weighs down on Hollywood writers of like, it's this mono myth. Well, no, Luke Skywalker is not a god. He's an orphan.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it truly is a fairy tale. So I think you're absolutely right. Like, trying to find what your personal connection is to these kinds of stories, and then you can make them big, and then you can reshape them and put them in any universe you want to.
Following up on that question, we just had one that popped up, and this is for Eddie and Adam, from Adam. And they talked about how you did use traditional fairy tales, but you also were dealing with the Disney versions. How did you feel putting your own take on such like iconic IP, specifically Frozen? How did you approach doing that?
Well, go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's interesting because I will say, unlike Kelly, we were more naive. So we didn't understand that Jiminy Cricket was Disney. We just thought that was public domain too, because we didn't go and really research this. So being at ABC, we were lucky in that way. But, you know, for instance, Adam, what were you gonna say?
So when we pitched once, we were idiots. Like we were like, Jimmy,
in a lot of ways we still may be.
We still may be idiots. That's true. But we were like, yeah, Jiminy Cricket, grumpy, and then like somebody pulled us aside at Disney and it's like, yeah, Disney owns this. Thank God you have a deal at Disney. You know, so it was because the original stories are, you know, they're more generic. It's the cricket. It's whatever it is. So, but to answer your question is, we always looked at it, and the way we wound up kind of framing it to Disney was, we're a Disney cul-de-sac. We're gonna take these IP out for a little spin. We're gonna try not to dent them, and then we're gonna park them back at the end of the day, and hopefully not damage them. And so what we would do is we would play with them within the kind of the confines of what they were, but we had leeway, and they were very trusting with us, and we would often talk with the creators of like the iconic animated movies. We talked to the geniuses behind Frozen and behind you know, Little Mermaid and all sorts of people that we never dreamed we would get to meet, and that was fantastic for us. But
Yeah, when we did, and so often, like when we did Brave, Pixar sent us the tartan. For, like the company was really supportive of the show, and I think we had the benefit of being the first to kind of take these toys off the shelf and start playing with them, because we beat the movie by a year, all the movies coming out. So I everyone was really supportive. Some things that were newer, like Frozen, you'd leave them a little bit, and things like Peter Pan, you're like, oh no, he's my seventh grade.
So like
So
for
you would have to choose what the tolerance was. People just met Elsa and Anna, and so they were still interested in just seeing them.
well, Frozen was a great example because it was so new in also such a phenomenon. We use those characters, but like our way in, while it was on an Elsa, we used the Snow Queen story and really made that a focus of the storytelling. And while Anna and Elsa were very key to the storytelling, it really became about the Snow Queen and how she related to Emma, our character. And we've created this connection, this mythology that worked within the confines of what Frozen did without changing anything Frozen did, and fit within our world. And we sort of
But a very once theme of somebody who feels different and wants to be the same, only to learn that that's what makes them special.
Right.
So Emma had magic and she wanted to get rid of it. And the Snow Queen, we realized, like Elsa, was ostracized and lost her sisters because she wasn't in control of it. So for us, it was like taking Frozen and then saying we're gonna push past that, and you're gonna meet her aunt.
Right. Now,
it's like another side character. The aunt's coming.
Right. But now the other extreme on that is Peter Pan, which when you watch that movie from the 50s and kids are smoking and and turned into donkeys, there's a little more.
No, that's Pinocchio.
I mean, Pinocchio. I'm sorry. But like with Pinocchio, right. You're like, okay, you can, there's a little leeway with what you can do with that. Or with Peter Pan, there's some stuff in that movie too that is maybe a little dated.
We were never interested in retelling the movies. Right. Us, that was boring. So like that's not really writing, right? That's transcribing. Like oh wow, a shot for shot remake of this story that they did in a 20 year. Like for us, we wanted to just say, what's the weirdest thing we can do?
Right.
And we would do that. Grumpy was originally named Dreamy, but he had his heart broken, so he became Grumpy. And that was like why he was and it goes back to asking a question. What's the character mystery? Why is Grumpy grumpy? Well, he had his heart broken. And we all get that. You're muted.
I'm Muty. That will be my dwarf name. Thank you all. So we all get grumpy. That's beautiful. Last question, we'll wrap up on this one, is, are there any recent examples of new or retellings of fairy tales that you connected with or you really enjoyed?
I think what I just mentioned, I like the Pixar movies, I think are like, to me, the new fairy tales, like, and like I think that's I'm always astounded.
Yeah.
You go ahead, Eddie.
No, I was gonna say I loved Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Had a happy ending that was historical revision, but I loved every moment of that film. And it didn't hit me until the end that it was a fairy tale, even though it was called Once Upon a Time, because I was like, well, Quentin Tarantino doesn't do fairy tales. Right. But he did.
Yeah.
That was a great example of a fairy tale in a historical revisionist in a new way that I hadn't seen before. So I thought that was great.
I think I think there's a lot of bad ones, but I won't say. But I think that the ones that are most successful to me are the ones that sort of shroud them a little bit in something new. Like I I don't know if this is true, but the movie Ex Machina, I love the
Mhm.
movie Ex Machina, but I think
Oh,
it's very close to the Bluebeard fairy tale. So if you love that movie, read the short fairy tale
yeah.
Bluebeard and see if it matches up. I also think things like Pan's Labyrinth and
Mhm.
you know these sort of wonderful. But I mean, I'm such a sucker for Princess Bride. It just
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
based anything. But I think those those films or those shows that just like Once Upon a Time that just like let's just go all in. Let's go all in. Are the ones I find most enchanting and magical. But I am interested in the ways that, how science fiction genre writers are changing fairy tales, how Western writers are adapting fairy tales. Like I think, Unforgiven is basically the Iliad. So like
Yeah.
there's just all these sort of, great connections that are going on. But I'm excited to see, what's to come.
Well, thank y'all for going all in, and thank y'all for doing such beautiful work with fairy tales.
Well, thanks for moderating.
Yes, thank you, Steve.
Other than that, thank all of you for coming and listening, and thank you again to our panelists. I have a list of people to thank, and I'm gonna like shotgun through it. Let's go. WGA Genre Committee. If you haven't been, we're a whole bunch of nerds. Come join us. We'll love you. WGA Genre Committee, our chair, Dwayne Johnson Cochran, Kelly Jo Brick, thank you. And our subcommittees for this were M. Miller Davis, Rashawn Dozia Escalona, and Joanna Pashtag. Thank y'all for helping us put this together. And I hope we all learned something. I hope we had fun, and let's go make some magic.
Thank you. Good
Thank
luck,
you.
everyone. Go get them.
Here, everyone.